"Shoot if they resist." The command crackled through the HOA chairman's radio right in my front yard. I didn't argue. I just grabbed my shovel. Clang metal under my rosebush. The whole neighborhood went silent. Comment what state you're watching from, and subscribe to La HOA Karen Stories 88 because this story will shock you more than the Flint water crisis. 3 patrol cars lined Maple Street, like we were hosting some kind of block party from hell. Officer Serena Johnson stood with her hand resting on her radio, watching me with those sharp eyes that miss nothing. Behind her, Priscilla Hargrove clutched her HOA violation folder like it contained nuclear launch codes. My 12-year-old daughter Ellie pressed her face against our living room window, holding up a handmade sign that read, "My dad rocks," in purple marker. That kid always knew how to time her support perfectly, and something about that simple gesture made half the neighbors who'd been glaring at me suddenly look uncomfortable. The whole mess started 3 weeks ago when Priscilla measured my grass and declared it violated HOA standards by 0.3 inches. 0.3 inches. In a country where we're debating whether to spend billions on border walls while our infrastructure crumbles, this woman was worried about grass height that you'd need a micrometer to measure. She'd marched up to my door with her little ruler and violation notice, talking about property values like she was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. What really got me suspicious was my water bill. 4 months running, it had jumped from $60 to over $200, and the city claimed they couldn't explain the usage spike. I'm Noah Whitaker, environmental engineer, and I've spent 15 years measuring things that actually matter like soil contamination and groundwater flow. My late wife Maya used to joke that I could find pollution in a pristine mountain stream if I looked hard enough. She wasn't wrong. After losing her to cancer 2 years ago, I'd thrown myself into work and raising Ellie, but this HOA nonsense felt personal. They were targeting the rose garden Maya, and I planted together the one place where her memory felt most alive. When Priscilla showed up with her bogus property map claiming a 3-foot strip behind my yard belonged to the homeowners association, I knew something stank worse than the Potomac River during algae season. That's when I noticed the ink on her documents looked fresh, the timestamps didn't match the city records, and the digital signatures had metadata showing they'd been created last Tuesday. This woman was manufacturing evidence like some kind of suburban dictator. So when she called the cops today and I heard that radio command about shooting if I resisted, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with her fake paperwork or waste time with appeals processes. I was going to dig. My shovel hit the soil right where Maya's memorial rosebush had been thriving for 2 years, and that metallic clang changed everything. The sound made Officer Johnson's eyebrows shoot up like she'd heard a gunshot. Priscilla actually stopped mid-sentence while she was explaining to the other officers about my dangerous defiance of community standards. The neighbors who'd been peeking through curtains suddenly appeared on porches and driveways. I kept digging, and within minutes I'd uncovered the corner of what looked like a military storage container. The green paint was faded but still visible, along with a red wax seal, and the unmistakable stamp of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, dated 1951. Priscilla, God bless her dedication to measurement, actually pulled out her ruler and tried to measure the length of the buried container, while I stared at her in amazement. Officer Johnson radioed for her supervisor while I carefully cleared more dirt away from what was obviously an official government document container. The whole scene felt surreal watching this woman measure buried evidence while federal protocols kicked into gear around us. Mrs. Beaumont from next door appeared at my fence line holding an old brass key that looked like it belonged in a museum. She was 78 years old and sharp as a tack, the kind of neighbor who remembered everything and forgot nothing. Secrets can stay buried for decades, she said, looking directly at Priscilla, but conscience has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. We opened that container with Officer Johnson documenting everything on her body camera following proper evidence protocols, because this was clearly bigger than a grass height violation. Inside were black and white photographs, showing men in suits shaking hands over blueprints, cash-changing hands, and detailed engineering drawings of an underground pipeline system. The photos showed Meridian Holdings Company representatives meeting with local officials, and the pipeline schematics showed a network running directly under our neighborhood. Most shocking was a photograph showing industrial chemical barrels being lowered into excavated holes with workers wearing hazmat suits, and a logo I couldn't quite make out but looked familiar. As I held those photographs with shaking hands, looking at evidence of corruption from 70 years ago, buried exactly where Maya and I had planted our memorial garden, the pieces started clicking together. My water bills. Priscilla's fake property maps the mysterious HOA pressure to sell certain houses, and now this underground network that someone had been hiding for decades. Timmy Barnes, the 16-year-old kid from down the street who live-streamed everything, had started broadcasting the whole scene to his followers. I looked straight into his camera and said the words that would go viral within hours. They said, "Shoot if we resist." I chose to dig for the truth instead. Jake Alvarez rolled up in his pickup truck with a commercial-grade drone and enough surveying equipment to map a small city. As a heavy machinery specialist who'd worked on half the construction projects in the county, Jake knew how to read the land like most people read newspapers. Officer Johnson had called in an EPA representative after seeing those 1951 photographs, and surprisingly everyone agreed to let us do a proper investigation. Maybe it was the federal evidence angle, or maybe small-town cops were just as curious as the rest of us about what exactly was buried under our suburban paradise. The ground-penetrating radar I'd rented from the university showed clear images of a 6-inch pipeline running east to west directly under my property and continuing toward Miller's Pond. Miss Dot guided us to the exact coordinates using landmarks from the old photographs, pointing out where the original survey markers used to stand before the neighborhood was developed. Her memory was like a historical GPS system, accurate down to the foot after 70 years. The laser mapping equipment revealed something that made my blood run cold. When I overlaid the current property boundaries with the utility maps and compared them to the 1,951 blueprints, a pattern emerged that was too systematic to be coincidental. Jake sent his drone up for aerial footage while I set up the soil testing kit. What we saw on that drone feed looked like a crime scene from above. The pipeline network formed a grid pattern under at least 12 properties, all of which had been targeted for HOA violations and pressure sales over the past 5 years. The houses that got the most HOA harassment sat directly over pipeline junction points. It was like someone was systematically trying to control access to specific properties, and Priscilla's violation campaigns weren't random harassment, they were strategic land grabs. The soil tests came back showing elevated levels of industrial solvents and heavy metals that had no business being in a residential area. These weren't trace amounts from old gasoline spills or household chemicals. These were concentrations that suggested decades of industrial waste disposal, the kind of contamination that makes the EPA declare Superfund cleanup sites. While I was processing these results, Priscilla launched into damage control mode, talking about property values and neighborhood stability like she was running for mayor. She even tried to pivot the conversation to immigration policy, suggesting that outside agitators were trying to destabilize our community values, which made Officer Johnson remind everyone to keep the discussion focused on the environmental evidence. That's when County Councilman Reed Langford showed up with a lawyer in tow. Reed was one of those politicians who smiled too much and talked about fiscal responsibility while somehow getting richer every election cycle. His first words were about not creating panic like the Flint water crisis or the East Palestine derailment, which immediately told me he knew more about this situation than he was letting on. When you're trying to downplay a potential environmental disaster by comparing it to other environmental disasters, you're basically confessing that there's a disaster worth comparing. His lawyer started talking about property rights and due process, but Officer Johnson shut that down by pointing out that federal evidence had been discovered and proper protocols were being followed. The EPA representative, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, arrived with testing equipment that made my university rental look like a toy. Her preliminary readings confirmed what I'd found, and then some. The contamination levels weren't just elevated, they were consistent with active industrial discharge, meaning whatever was in those pipes was still flowing. She immediately ordered a temporary evacuation of the 3 houses closest to the highest contamination readings and called for federal backup. Ellie packed her overnight bag with the kind of calm efficiency that broke my heart, moving in with Mrs. Dot like this was just another adventure instead of a potential health crisis. Jake's drone footage revealed the most disturbing piece of the puzzle. Miller's Pond, the centerpiece of our neighborhood and the reason most people moved here, was showing water level drops that weren't consistent with seasonal patterns or drought conditions. The aerial shots clearly showed a concrete pumping station partially exposed on the far shore, with fresh tire tracks leading to and from the access road. Someone had been actively maintaining industrial equipment at our scenic neighborhood pond, disguising it as park maintenance, while operating what appeared to be a pumping system connected to the underground pipeline network. As the sun set on what had started as a simple grass height dispute, we had federal investigators setting up a command post in my front yard, soil samples being rushed to laboratories, and a live stream that had attracted 50,000 viewers watching small-town America discover that their biggest environmental threat wasn't coming from foreign countries or distant factories. It was buried right under their suburban lawns, hidden by HOA regulations and maintained through local political corruption. The real shock came when Dr. Chen's equipment detected active flow in the pipeline system, with readings suggesting high-volume pumping had occurred within the last 24 hours. Priscilla had borrowed a radio from one of the contractors to coordinate what she called damage control, but she'd apparently never learned how to use the privacy channels. At exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, while she was standing 20 feet from Officer Johnson's patrol car, her radio transmitted directly through the police scanner system that every news outlet in the county monitors. Her exact words broadcast to anyone listening were, "Call the removal team now. If they find the main intake point, this whole operation is finished." The local news van that had been covering our environmental story suddenly had a much bigger scoop. Timmy's live stream exploded with comments, as viewers heard a real-time confession of conspiracy being broadcast over police radio frequencies. The chat was moving so fast it looked like digital chaos, with people from 12 different states commenting about similar HOA pressure campaigns in their neighborhoods. What had started as a local environmental issue was becoming a pattern recognition exercise for viewers who'd experienced mysterious property devaluations, sudden HOA violations, and pressure to sell to specific development companies. The hashtag Pipegate started trending within an hour of that radio transmission. Jake's drone captured footage that looked like an environmental thriller movie. Miller's Pond was dropping fast enough that you could see the wet marks on the shoreline from this morning's water level. The exposed concrete structure wasn't park maintenance equipment, it was industrial pumping infrastructure designed to move massive volumes of liquid. The aerial view showed multiple intake pipes extending into the pond like underwater straws connected to a pumping system powerful enough to drain a small lake. This wasn't environmental contamination from decades-old buried chemicals, this was active environmental crime happening in real time. My 3D mapping results revealed the scope of what we were dealing with. 12 properties in our subdivision sat directly over major pipeline intersections, and every single one had been targeted for HOA violations, property tax appeals, or pressure sales within the past 3 years. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental. Someone had been systematically targeting homeowners who lived above critical infrastructure points using HOA harassment to force sales and maintain access to underground pumping stations. Priscilla's violation campaigns weren't about community standards, they were about controlling access to an industrial operation disguised as suburban living. Residents started coming forward with health complaints that painted a disturbing picture. Chronic respiratory issues, pets getting sick from drinking puddle water, and a cluster of unusual cancers that everyone had attributed to bad luck or genetics. Mrs. Eleanor Fitch, who'd been Priscilla's biggest supporter, publicly apologized for enabling what she now recognized as a systematic poisoning of our community. The woman who'd organized fundraisers for HOA landscaping projects admitted she'd been manipulated into supporting environmental destruction disguised as neighborhood improvement. Reed Langford tried to control the narrative by talking about property values and economic stability, but his damage control strategy backfired spectacularly when Dr. Chen interrupted his press conference with preliminary lab results. The contamination levels weren't just dangerous, they were criminal. Industrial solvents at concentrations that suggested decades of illegal dumping heavy metals, consistent with manufacturing waste and chemical signatures that matched known carcinogens. When Reed tried to minimize the findings by talking about regulatory overreach and job creation, Officer Johnson reminded him that he was being recorded and might want to consider his legal exposure. The most damning evidence came from Mrs. Dott's historical archives. She'd kept detailed records of every neighborhood change since 1951, including zoning variances, construction permits, and property transfers. Her documents showed that Meridian Holdings had been systematically acquiring underground easements through shell companies, bribing local officials to reclassify land use permits, and maintaining illegal industrial operations under the cover of residential development. The paper trail connected 7 decades of corruption from the original pipeline installation through the current HOA conspiracy to maintain access to pumping infrastructure. Priscilla's psychological breakdown was as dramatic as it was revealing. She started measuring everything in sight with increasing desperation, as if maintaining her obsessive control over lawn heights could somehow restore her authority over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. She measured the police tape the height of the news van, and even tried to determine whether the federal investigation tent violated setback requirements. Watching her apply HOA regulations to a federal crime scene would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. The underground pumping equipment was operating at industrial capacity, moving thousands of gallons per hour from Miller's Pond through the pipeline network toward an unknown destination. Ground vibrations detected by seismic equipment confirmed that massive pumps were running continuously, explaining both the dropping water levels and the infrastructure maintenance that had been disguised as neighborhood beautification projects. Someone had been operating a full-scale industrial extraction operation under our homes while we worried about grass height and mailbox colors. The perimeter expanded overnight as EPA, FBI, and Army Corps of Engineers vehicles turned our quiet subdivision into the center of a federal environmental crime investigation. Yellow tape marked contamination zones, while specialists in hazmat suits collected soil samples from a dozen properties. The contrast was surreal: federal agents treating our neighborhood like a toxic waste site, while Priscilla continued her obsessive measuring campaign, now focused on determining whether the investigation equipment violated HOA aesthetic guidelines. Agent Miguel Park arrived with a briefcase full of federal warrants and a task force specialized in environmental crimes involving organized corruption. He listened to my presentation of the evidence chain from the 1,951 photographs through the current contamination readings with the focused attention of someone who'd seen this pattern before. The industrial pipeline network, the systematic property targeting the local political cover, and the ongoing environmental crime added up to what he called a textbook case of long-term environmental conspiracy involving multiple levels of government corruption. Priscilla's negotiation attempt was simultaneously desperate and insulting. She offered to arrange temporary relocation assistance for affected families in exchange for what she called discreet resolution of the misunderstanding. Her exact words were that the HOA could provide vouchers for hotel stays while the situation was resolved quietly, as if federal environmental crimes could be settled like parking ticket disputes. Mrs. Dott's response was perfect. You can buy silence, Priscilla, but you can't buy back 70 years of lies. The evidence against Reed Langford came from Mrs. Dott's historical document collection, specifically emails between Reed and Meridian Holdings discussing zoning changes and construction permits. The correspondence showed a systematic pattern of political corruption, with Reed facilitating illegal land use modifications in exchange for campaign contributions and personal payments. When Agent Park arrested Reed on conspiracy and environmental endangerment charges, Reed's final words were about economic development and job creation, as if poisoning residential neighborhoods was some kind of public service. Eleanor Fitch's public reversal became the tipping point for community opinion. She'd been Priscilla's most vocal supporter, organizing HOA social events and defending property management decisions for 3 years. Her televised apology to the neighborhood for enabling environmental crimes was emotional and specific. She admitted to being manipulated into supporting policies that harmed her neighbors' health and property values while enriching criminal conspirators. Her detailed confession included specifics about how HOA meetings were controlled, how violation campaigns were coordinated, and how community resistance was systematically suppressed. The arrest of Priscilla Hargrove was captured live on Timmy's stream with 40,000 viewers watching in real time. Even while being handcuffed, she attempted to measure the distance between her wrists and the patrol car door, as if proper measurements could somehow restore order to her collapsing world. Jake's commentary was perfect. Now she's measuring her remaining freedom in hours instead of inches. The image of a woman being arrested for environmental conspiracy while obsessively measuring law enforcement equipment became an instant meme across social media platforms. The scope of federal charges expanded as investigators uncovered the full extent of the criminal operation. Conspiracy to commit environmental crimes, fraud, corruption of public officials, and violations of federal water protection laws carried combined sentences that could put the conspirators in prison for decades. The systematic targeting of homeowners through fake HOA violations to maintain access to illegal industrial infrastructure showed premeditation and sophisticated criminal planning that elevated charges from misdemeanors to federal felonies. Dr. Chen's expedited laboratory results confirmed that the contamination posed immediate health risks, requiring expanded evacuation and emergency medical screening for residents who'd been exposed to toxic chemicals for years without knowing it. The industrial solvents found in soil samples were consistent with manufacturing processes that had been illegal for decades, suggesting that Meridian Holdings had been using our neighborhood as a disposal site for hazardous waste while maintaining the appearance of suburban residential development. The environmental crime investigation revealed infrastructure that shocked even federal specialists. The underground pumping system was sophisticated enough to move massive volumes of contaminated water from residential areas to illegal disposal sites while maintaining normal appearance of neighborhood landscaping and utilities. Motion sensors, remote monitoring equipment, and automated pumping controls showed that this was a professional industrial operation disguised as suburban living, not some kind of amateur environmental violation. Timmy's livestream coverage evolved from neighborhood drama to citizen journalism, as viewers from across the country shared similar experiences with mysterious HOA campaigns, unexplained utility bill increases, and pressure to sell properties to specific development companies. The national attention transformed our local environmental crime into a case study for how corporate environmental criminals use local government corruption and neighborhood associations to hide illegal operations in plain sight. The official dissolution of the Maple Street Homeowners Association was announced through certified mail to every resident, along with federal seizure notices for all HOA assets and records. Eleanor Fitch was elected as interim coordinator for a new resident council based on transparency and community health rather than property control and violation enforcement. The transition from authoritarian property management to democratic neighborhood governance happened surprisingly smoothly once residents understood how extensively they'd been manipulated and endangered by the previous system. Priscilla's final arrest was almost artistic in its irony. Federal agents found her in the HOA office at 2 a.m. measuring case files and trying to organize evidence by regulation compliance rather than criminal relevance. She was still clutching her measuring ruler when they put the handcuffs on, muttering about proper filing procedures while being charged with federal conspiracy. Her obsession with measurement and control had become so pathological that she couldn't stop applying HOA standards even while being arrested for using those standards to cover up environmental crimes. The criminal asset forfeiture process provided immediate funding for environmental cleanup and resident relocation assistance. Priscilla's personal assets, the HOA bank accounts, and properties connected to the conspiracy were seized under federal environmental crime statutes. The money that had been used to maintain illegal industrial infrastructure and bribe local officials was redirected toward medical screening for exposed residents and professional environmental remediation. For the first time in decades, neighborhood finances were being used to protect residents rather than exploit them. My appointment as regional environmental monitor was both professional recognition and personal vindication. The position involves investigating suspected environmental crimes and coordinating with federal agencies to protect communities from illegal industrial operations. Ellie's response to my new job title was perfect. "Now you're a professional secret digger, Dad." The work feels meaningful in a way that academic environmental engineering never did, probably because it involves protecting real families from real threats rather than studying theoretical contamination models. Timmy's viral documentation of our neighborhood investigation launched his career in citizen journalism and environmental advocacy. His livestream coverage reached over 2 million viewers and inspired similar investigations in communities across the country where residents had experienced mysterious HOA campaigns and unexplained environmental problems. Major news networks hired him as a consultant on environmental crime coverage, proving that good journalism can happen anywhere when someone cares enough to document the truth. Mrs. Dot became a local celebrity and historical preservation advocate after her 70-year archive of neighborhood documents provided crucial evidence for federal prosecutions. Her photograph collection and community records are now part of a traveling exhibition about environmental crime and community resistance. Her favorite quote for news interviews became, "Keeping photos for 70 years isn't hoarding, it's keeping faith that truth will eventually surface." The cleanup operation transformed our neighborhood into a showcase for environmental restoration and community empowerment. Federal environmental specialists removed contaminated soil, installed proper water filtration systems, and restored Miller's Pond to its original condition while maintaining full transparency about remediation progress. The contrast with Priscilla's secretive violation campaigns couldn't have been more dramatic. Real environmental protection involves community participation and public accountability, not hidden agendas and authoritarian control. Franklin Webb's approach was subtle and unsettling in a way that made my environmental engineer instincts go on high alert. He introduced himself as Meridian Holdings, Director of Environmental Compliance, spoke with the calm confidence of someone who'd handled federal investigations before, and left a business card that simply read, "A friend who knows what's buried deeper." His final words about checking my basement tonight suggested that our neighborhood investigation had uncovered only the surface level of a much larger environmental crime network. The community garden project that replaced Priscilla's violation enforcement became a symbol of how neighborhoods can protect themselves through cooperation and transparency instead of control and secrecy. Eleanor led a group of residents in planting new roses around Maya's memorial garden, creating a living monument to community resilience and environmental justice. Ellie helped design the garden layout, proving that 12-year-olds understand environmental protection better than most HOA boards. The basement discovery that ended our story was both resolution and revelation. The sound of dripping water led to a hidden access point for the industrial pumping system with maintenance logs showing that our basement had been used as a monitoring station for decades without our knowledge. The operation was more sophisticated and longer running than anyone had imagined, with our own home serving as a secret control center for environmental crimes that had poisoned our neighbors while enriching criminal conspirators who disguised industrial operations as suburban community management. Environmental crime thrives in secrecy, but transparency and community action can expose even the most sophisticated criminal operations. Our neighborhood learned that real property values come from environmental health and community trust, not authoritarian control and hidden agendas. When residents work together with courage and professional expertise, they can defeat criminal conspirators who use local government corruption and fake community standards to hide environmental destruction. The most important lesson from our experience is that environmental justice starts with community awareness and citizen action. Corporate criminals count on residents being too intimidated, isolated, or misinformed to investigate suspicious activities in their own neighborhoods. But when communities organize around transparency and environmental protection, they can expose criminal operations that have been hidden for decades and hold powerful interests accountable for environmental crimes that harm real families, in real communities. Here at La Hoa Karen Stories 88, we believe every neighborhood has stories of residents who stood up against corrupt authority figures who prioritized control over community welfare. Our channel documents real experiences of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary corruption in their daily lives and fought back with courage, creativity, and community support. Each story reveals how environmental crime, financial fraud, and abuse of power can be defeated when residents refuse to accept false explanations and demand real accountability from officials who claim to serve their interests. Subscribe to La HOA Karen Stories 88 for more investigations into how communities can protect themselves from corrupt officials who use legitimate authority to hide illegal activities. Check out our previous episodes documenting similar cases of environmental crime disguised as community management, and remember that the best protection against corruption is an informed community that refuses to accept secrecy and demands transparency from anyone claiming to act in their interest.